Hello everybody, I'm Phil Marriott. So we are Boys on Film. We're reviewing a much talked about horror film today that we were lucky enough to see a little preview screening of just a few days before it opened on the Friday. It's called Barbarian. It stars Bill Skarsgård, otherwise known as Pennywise. Does it deserve the hype though? And look, it's my very good friend Chris. How are you, Chris?
How are you, Phil? I'm very good, thank you.
Have you recovered from the screening?
I have recovered. The pulse has calmed down again, and I don't want to cut to the chase here, but yeah, the hype is pretty good, I'd say.
So we were talking about this and the whole kind of mood of the film and the hype surrounding it. You know, everybody's saying it's one of the best modern horror films at the moment, and I always hate that when you go into a horror film and everybody's saying, you know, it's the best thing since The Exorcist. It's like, hang on a minute, The Exorcist is way up there. There we go. Oh, conveniently. He's wearing the t-shirt. So this is written and directed by Zach Cregger, I think his name is pronounced. It hit UK cinemas last Friday, so we're just getting around to reviewing this because we saw it, like I say, on the Wednesday. It has been a sleeper hit at the box office in the States. I think it premiered at San Diego Comic-Con back in July. So people in the States have been talking about it, which has been quite frustrating for us in the UK, I think, because we're kind of itching to see it. Did you know much about it before?
No, and I absolutely try to avoid knowing anything at all about it. And I don't want to spoil it for anyone else during this review, but, you know, it's... One of its great successes for me is that it references some of the great horror classics that you're referring to, but actually doesn't just copy them, doesn't mirror them particularly, but there are just elements of great classic horror about this film that, you know, actually give it a real solidity for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's got a really good cast as well. Georgina Campbell, who I think is from the UK. In fact, I did a little bit of research on her, and she's from Maidstone. And she was raised in Dartford, which is where I grew up. Well, just round the corner, Crocken Hill.
You could have been her. Maybe you are her.
She stars as the main character. We'll talk about the story in a second. But she also was in Black Mirror and Broadchurch. Yeah. So she's done a lot of TV work. I think this is probably her first major feature film role. Bill Skarsgård we know as Pennywise. And again, we'll come on to him because I think there's quite a clever way of introducing him into the movie. Justin Long, do you remember him in Jeepers Creepers? Have you seen Jeepers Creepers?
We love Jeepers Creepers in this house, yeah. Who was he in Jeepers Creepers?
The main character. There were two, weren't they?
Yes. I was sitting there for 2 hours in the film thinking, how do I know this guy? That's how I know him.
And Drag Me to Hell, he was in that film as well.
And a great performance from him, again, because one thing, like I said, I really enjoyed about this film is the fact that it, you know, there's little pieces of familiarity about it, so you get lulled a little bit into thinking, oh, okay, this is, I kind of get this. I know these actors, and I know what good horror is all about, and it starts to kind of do all of that. But of course, there are things that kind of twist and subvert that through the film. For me, that's a really clever thing to do, to give it enough familiarity and enough sort of newness, you know, to keep it fresh.
The plot centres around a woman who's played by Georgina Campbell. She goes to an Airbnb, discovering that the house has been rented also by somebody else who's Bill Skarsgård's character. So the first part of it, you're kind of thinking, hang on a minute, obviously because of the recognition that it's Bill Skarsgård, we know him as always playing the baddies, or usually playing the baddies in films. You kind of think, you know, she shouldn't be there. She knows she shouldn't be there as well, and that's quite a clever thing because it's obviously tapping into that. It's tapping into that kind of woman alone thing, going to a house where there's a stranger she doesn't know, and then they hit it off.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but, you know, what's really interesting is that, I don't know about you, but I had this really interesting internal debate in that first part of the film about, well, is he a bad guy or is he not a bad guy? You know, he's saying all the right things, but bad guys say all the right things, so, you know, that's what he would be doing. And then you think, oh, well, maybe it would be too obvious he's the bad guy, and maybe he is just an innocent victim in all this, just like she is, or maybe she's the bad guy. And, you know, you spend that first part of the film really thinking about that stuff because the setup is on the surface a very straightforward one, but actually the dialogue, the action is kind of it twists and you sort of, it misleads you and it takes you down little paths and you start to think, oh, maybe her, maybe him, and then before you know it, you have no idea who it is, you know.
I don't know about you, but I felt like it had a feel of what Sam Raimi's done in the past, because it had that comic book feel about it, but also, you know that the director's going to push buttons. I mean, the audience where we saw it on the Wednesday, that they clearly loved it, because they were shrieking out, they were laughing. I mean, there's a lot of comedy in this film, which, you know, like I was saying before we started recording, I don't always like comedy horrors, but this seemed to get the balance right.
This really worked for me because actually there were three things that really, really all balanced. If you could have a three-legged seesaw, this would be a three-legged seesaw, because, you know, the humour in it, the pace, and the kind of just obviously the downright horror actually all work together to really increase the drama. So again, going back to this thing about the hype, you know, it's a well-made film. It's a good script because there's actually a really good balance between the humour, the pace, and the horror. You know, the pace is really important, as we know in these films, because, you know, you don't want all the blood and guts spilling in the first scene, or sometimes you do, but, you know, the pace is really important because it helps to build the tension. The humour in this film really did the same for me. You know, it really aided and abetted the kind of perversity of the horror when it happened. You know, that you'd seen some funny things, and that, you know, some stuff sort of made us laugh in an uncomfortable way sometimes. But, you know, that really just made it more horrific when it happened. It really enhanced everything for me. So all those three things working in chorus, you know, was really powerful for me. Absolutely, the humour was really good, and yeah, where we saw it, absolutely, you're right. The crowd and us, as well as people who love horror films, you know, I think that we've all got our behaviours, haven't you? And, you know, it kind of seems really weird to be laughing at parts of a horror film, but I think part of that as a horror fan is that you're excited about, you know, what's going on. You can feel this build up about what's going on, and you know, the pair of us were sitting there kind of squeaking with excitement at various points because we knew that something really horrible was going to happen, and it was kind of funny along the way. You know, that was really fun about it.
Squeaking, I love that in a horror film. I think you need to squeak. You need to do at least 3 squeaks during the whole movie.
Yeah. To be fair, part of that was my seat, but yeah, lots of it was me.
One thing I did notice that you did was you were running on the spot. I could hear your feet going. Really? The clattering of your shoes like on the floor.
It's funny, you know, I'm not a big jumper in films generally, but a couple of times in this movie I jumped, you know, and I did. You know, I was very engaged in it, actually. I think for lots of reasons, but for those 3 things I talked about, the kind of humour and the humanity of it, and the pace of it, and as well as the kind of horrific bits, actually just really engage you. And, you know, I felt quite involved and quite invested. As I say, you know, this debate you have in the first part of the film where you're like, well, who's the person who's done wrong here? You know, is she the malevolent figure? Is he the malevolent figure? Is he just somebody else? You know, have they been brought there by, you know, all that kind of mystery really engages you in it. Really.
Yeah. And it's a real mixed bag as well. I described it on social media as being a really fun horror movie, because some horror films, and I love all different types of horror films, usually the good ones are the best ones, but with this, I never felt kind of despondent or weary or depressed. It's quite a bright horror film, despite there being a lot of gloominess. There is gloominess to it, and claustrophobia, my God. I mean, there's some really effective scenes where you just feel so closed in, because they obviously, they discover a part of the house without going into detail that would make you very uncomfortable.
Do you know what? I was having a super gay thought through that whole bit as well. And again, I'm not going to try really hard not to do a spoiler here, but I kept thinking about a certain early 90s Madonna record, vaguely styled on the house in Vogue scene, called Deeper and Deeper. Because basically what's going on, and I did say it was a super gay thought.
I love how you've managed to get that reference into this movie review.
You're talking about this being a fun horror film, and, you know, I literally was, while some of this horrible stuff was going on, you know, the characters are getting deeper and deeper into the situation, metaphorically, and deeper into the sort of physical world that they're in. And Madonna was singing to me through that period.
It's got a really interesting plot as well, isn't it? Because it's a story that I think has been well thought about. And also, I think, you know, because obviously the director is obviously the writer as well, Zach Cregger, he's got a comedy background, so he's obviously got that experience with humour. But also, I think he's been clever with the story because it does twist and turn, and it does surprise you. I didn't see a lot of it coming. I mean, there were a lot of unexpected twists, and it made it more of an enjoyable ride for me, because that, you know, some horrors are predictable, really predictable, especially modern horror films.
And I don't want to get all sort of formal and degree in film studies about this, but, you know, for me, it had a really, really interesting structure. And, you know, this is like the proper film critic statement here, but, you know, it's a proper film of 3 halves. because you sort of go through this first sequence in the film, this first part of the film, and it builds to a crescendo in this amazing way because of the way the tension happens, and there's lots of setup that's happening, and it builds up to these kind of horrific events. And it really builds up like a really good piece of music, actually, in terms of it builds up to this crescendo and stops. And then the second part starts of this film. And you kind of think, oh, okay, great. Well, that means it's going to be a film of two halves then. And then actually what happens is that the second half kind of comes to an end as well. Not quite with the same drama, but it definitely kind of ends. And you end up with this third half, which is... I mean, the reason I'm calling it three halves and not three thirds is because of that oddness, that, the unfamiliarity, the uncanny that you get in horror films. When that break happens between the first and the second parts, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, fine, I get it. It's a film of two halves. And then it kind of happens again. Wow, how many times is this going to keep happening?
Yeah.
But for me, again, that, like I say, I don't want to be too formal about it, but actually that, as a structural piece, we know helps us as an audience to engage with the film and to go with the drama and those peaks and troughs of it. It's, as you say, because the writer and the director, I mean, I didn't know they were the same person, but that it was a very well integrated piece of writing and filmmaking in that regard. I mean, it kind of sounds like I'm, making an Oscar speech here, and I don't mean to. It's not necessarily one of the greatest movies ever made, but it's a well constructed, really well thought out movie, because it did all the things to us as a horror audience that horror films are supposed to, and some of them don't, and this one did.
And he also ties up those loose ends that you think are loose ends, because it's fractured into so many different parts.
I think there's a loose end that doesn't get tied up, but
I'm not
going to do a spoiler. Not going to do a spoiler.
Yeah, no, I remember you saying at the end, because Justin Long plays AJ, who's a sitcom actor.
He's a bad boy.
Yeah, he's been done for sexual harassment, hasn't he, in previous job. So he goes back to the house because we find out that he's the owner of that house. So obviously that's another thread of that story. But the way it's all tied up at the end, they all come together. Yeah, it's really clever. It's a popcorn movie. It's a roller coaster ride. It's a great horror film. It's a great comedy, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to talk a little bit about the baddie somehow. The evil, the figure. In Halloween, they call them the Shape, and I kind of, let's just call them the Shape here as well, because I don't want to give away who that figure is. But, a lot of really interesting things about that. And again, that it references films that we're familiar with. It references situations that we've all been in as human beings, that figure, I think, to some degree as well. And because of that character's really able to play on our taboo, which of course is what all great horror's built on, the kind of the horror of the everyday being twisted in that way so that it's kind of really unfamiliar and really unpleasant. That figure, that character is really able to do that because of what that figure is. Is that spoiler free enough? But I felt that character was really interesting.
And taps into our emotions, like you said earlier. It's very clever with certain horror films that do that. Like I mentioned, Carrie, that manages to do it because I think that's the best kind of horror in some situations, because you feel attached to that character.
Absolutely. And there's a sort of perennial kind of survival instinct that this evil figure has, which actually, when you align that with what that figure represents to us all, it totally makes sense. But of course, in a horror environment, that's horrific and familiar all at the same time, of course. Brilliant basis for a horror film. I mean, it's great. Got to also give another shout out for the typography and the font in the title sequence.
Yeah.
Which, again, refers... Actually, this won't be a spoiler, but it's the same font that's used in Halloween, or at least a very, very similar one. And so that means that from the very first few seconds of the film, you start to see writing on the screen, like you do in any... in some movies when they start. And you already know, oh, okay, this is referring to things that I already know and I'm scared by. For me, that was a tiny little detail that I really liked.
Yeah, and it's really clever with the marketing as well, because you see that poster, and the poster's red and black. Yeah. And it's very, like I said, when we saw the film, kind of brutalist, gives you that impression of old school, maybe 70s horror that I wasn't going to say snuff movies, not snuff movies, grindhouse horror that makes you feel quite uneasy. So already you've got that unease before seeing the film.
Definitely, and but then coupled with, as you said at the beginning, right, with that fact that it's about an Airbnb and two people turning up and they do lots of stuff on their phones to kind of, like you do, using an app to try and work out, who was supposed to be there and who's not supposed to be there. So actually completely contemporary, but with enough of that familiarity to kind of ground you in, in the everyday lives we all lead. There was a sort of believability about it because of that, which again, for me, is a truly great horror thing that, maybe this could happen to me, maybe I could turn up at my next Airbnb and some crazy woman's going to be there, or some crazy man, or, whoever the person is, that could happen.
Yeah, it's relatable, isn't it? And I think that's what makes it genuinely scary, because it is, like I say, it's a mixed bag. It's not just scares, but there are a lot of good scares, very effective scares in this.
Definitely. I mean, if it was scary enough for me to be running on the spot, then yeah, it was scary.
And me squeaking.
I don't do that for every film. I squeak a bit more often, but I don't tend to run on the spot that often.
So star rating then. Well, over to you for star rating. What are you going to give it?
Oh my word. I'm going to go at least 4 out of 5. Sorry, I don't know how many stars I'm meant to be awarding out of.
It's out of 5, yeah.
It's not a perfect film, and I'm going to reserve 5 for perfection, so there aren't very many of those handed out. So I'm going to go for a very strong 4,
I'm the same. I'd be interested to hear why you thought it didn't deserve that final star, though.
I'm going to be finicky and say the little bit of untidy plot at the end where I think there's a little thing that just hasn't got resolved. I'm a bit of a completist. I don't write a list in my head of things going on wrong in the film to make sure they get resolved, but but I do.
Why not? That would be fun.
I kind of do. So there was just one little thing where either I just missed it because it was fairly insignificant, or I was too busy running away or something, I don't know, or it was never really quite resolved. But I think it actually, for me, it's got more powerful the more I've thought about it, which is always a great thing. Films that you just go and see kind of entertain you for 2 hours and you literally forget about them are fine, but this one didn't, for all those reasons of familiarity and stuff. So it was really strong in that regard. Why wasn't it perfect? That's a really good question.
It's a hard question, isn't it? I'm trying to ask myself the same.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you, Philip. Why did you
put me on the spot?
The stars and not 5?
I was kind of expecting it to be not as good as it was. Not
right.
that explains why I haven't given it 5 stars, but I think for a horror film, it's got to be something that I would continually come back to time and time again. And I don't think it would. I think, although I would like to see it again, I don't think it's got that longevity thing. I think I was going to say there are things that we've seen before, but that's really difficult, I think, for a new modern horror film not to be similar to what we've seen already, because that must be so difficult, I think, if you're a horror director.
I think that all gives it credibility, actually, for me. That familiarity makes things actually more haunting for me a lot of the time. I mean, yes, okay, if someone just literally picks up bits of other films and puts them together and makes a new film, that is a bit lazy. This film, I didn't think did that, but it was clever enough in its references and clever enough in its relatability without being sort of over familiar, without getting too tired about cliche and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I agree with you. I'm definitely going to see it again. Absolutely, we'll be watching this again. But I don't think I'm going to be reaching for it on the shelf in years to come as a sort of massive classic like I do for other films.
Yeah.
But I don't think. But to be honest, it could be a bit of a sleeper, and there's something about it that gets under your skin. Again, like all good horror, and something that keeps scratching away at the door and haunting you a little bit. And I think that might mean it comes back more than we think it's going to be honest.
It's a massive hit. I mean, it was filmed on a budget of $4.5 million, and it's made $42 million already. So it's definitely successful.
My fee for this interview is more than that.
What? That's something we didn't discuss. Now I'm scared. I'm running on the spot and squeaking just a tad. Chris, so brilliant to chat to you about horror. We've got to do it again, because I love talking horror. Everybody who knows me knows that they're all bored of me just talking about so many horror films.
Just to do a little ad for you, if anyone ever wants to go and see a horror film and needs to take someone, take Phil. Because this man loves and knows horror like nobody else does. So if you need to go with you, take Phil for sure. And I definitely want to go to the films with you again, for sure.
Fantastic. That's the right thing to say. I'm so glad you said that. Where can people find you? Because you're like me, a DJ. You're playing in London a lot. You played with John John Plays Women on Friday at Carpet Burn.
That's right. I go under the name of Chris de Buerre, spelled incorrectly with an E and the U the wrong way round, because sadly I didn't do very well at school and I didn't know how you spelled Buerre, so I spelled it wrong, and I've been stuck with that for the 20 years ever since. So I'm a weekly resident on Fridays at the Eagle London in Vauxhall. I have a Mixcloud, mixcloud.com/Chris de Buerre. You can hear me in all those places in real life or streaming, and obviously you might hear me on more movie reviews if I cut my fee down from 5 million.
Yeah, please do that. Do it soon. Good to see you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got plenty more horror films on the way. See you soon. Bye for now.